Medieval Tavern, Europe. In medieval times, taverns were a place to socialize, much like today's pubs. Most houses were often small and cramped, so the tavern offered a place where friends and neighbors could meet, socialize, relax, amuse, and exchange ideas. As well as taverns, there were smaller alehouses which served home-brewed ale and beer. There were more alehouses in towns and villages than taverns and inns. Inns were the largest type of drinking house and usually located close to the city gates. They provided lodgings alongside food and drink for weary travelers such as merchants. Inns were also a good place to do trading and provided stables for horses. Churches were the other place for communities to gather and were the opposite in terms of morality. Taverns, alehouses, and inns were places of drinking, gambling, violence, and criminal activity, which the church criticized them for. From the 14th century, signs were hung outside with pictures that depicted motifs drawn from heraldry or something that could be easily remembered during a time of mass illiteracy. Before this, alehouses had an ale stake or ale pole above the door to show that they had a brew ready and was open for business. Taverns had a pole with leaves called a bush for this purpose. It is speculated that this bush or pole might have been used to stir beer in the fermenting trough. Alcohol was of course one of the biggest parts of the tavern. Beers, ales, and wines were on offer, which would have been cheap as taxing it would not have been well received. These would be served by the barmaid in a pitcher or mug made of leather or wood. Wine was unique to the taverns as it was more expensive and attracted the rich patrons that visited. It was consumed on a daily basis in France and imported in England where it couldn't be produced well, which made it more expensive there. Brewers were mostly women, in particular at the start of the medieval period. Often, the brewery would be in the same building, but if it wasn't, it was supplied by a brewer who the tavern keeper was indebted to, as he was likely not as well off. Food was sometimes also offered, which was usually low quality. It might be bread or salted fish, or bacon and roast meat. The meat could be served in pottage, a type of cooking stew, or as a pie. The meal was served from a plate onto trenchers made of stale bread or wood. Food was eaten with your bare hands, and if you brought them with you, your personal knife and spoon. Forks were rare at this time and a novelty. The atmosphere would be noisy and dark, with the source of light coming from the crackling fireplace and table candles. You would be sitting on a bench with your table, which was called a board, formed from planks laid out on supports called trestles or two barrels, which could be packed away later. The smell would be quite unpleasant, with the body odor and unwashed clothes of drinkers, and the floor would be covered in filth, a mixture of horse manure, mud, and rushes of straw and bits of dropped food. The games played inside drinking houses would be cards or dice for the purposes of gambling. As well as this, an early modern version of bowling and short-range archery was played. As the night went on, excessive drinking caused arguments and fights. There are accounts by royal coroners from the 13th century. One example is of a drunk man who came out of a tavern and fell into a well in the marketplace and drowned. Violent attacks were also frequent. In 1272, a drunk man called Robert Bernard had come from Robert Mollin's tavern and killed Ralph, son of Ralph, vicar of Bramham, with an axe to the head, who had innocently answered his question of who he was. Today, the taverns, inns, and alehouses are collectively referred to as pubs or public houses.